My name is Ishmael. Classic line. Just about everyone knows that, even if they've never read the book itself, which is, of course, Moby Dick, written by Melville back in the 1800s. And it is a book about whaling, which was a big industry back then. And there's one interesting chapter in this book that deals with ambergris. And now that is an amazing substance. It is not whale vomit, as it is often said. It actually comes out from the other end of the sperm whale. But what is this thing? Sperm whales will dine on all kinds of seafood, but mostly squid. Now, squid have a mouth, and that mouth is sort of like a beak, very much like a parrot's beak, hard stuff. So when the whale swallows these, sometimes the stuff, the beaks and all of that, doesn't come out. It gets stuck in the whale's intestine. And then a bunch of fats and proteins and other molecules build up around this thing, and they form sort of a glob. And eventually that glob comes out from the other end of the whale. It is lighter than water, so it floats. And it has a terrible, terrible stench. However, when it is exposed to the air and reacts with oxygen, it develops a much more pleasant smell and is much sought after by perfumers. Not only because a small amount of it in a perfume will give the perfume a very, very pleasant smell, but also because it prevents the smell of the perfume from evaporating quickly. So ambergris is called a fixative. But it is very hard to find. And beachcombers will look on beaches for these deposits. It's pretty ugly looking. This is what it looks like. It kind of looks like a rock, and but it's somewhat squishy. So that's ambergris. Today, of course, perfumers don't have to rely on finding it in the ocean, because the active ingredient, the actual compound that produces the smell, ambroxan, can be produced in the laboratory, and it is available to perfumers. It isn't cheap. It's quite difficult to make. But there are those people who really are still after the original stuff, and are out there looking at the ocean, looking at beaches. But whales back in those days, of course, were not hunted for their ambergris. They were hunted for their fat, because that was used to make candles. Back in those days, if you had to deal with darkness, the only way to do it was with candles, or, of course, a fireplace. And whale oil made for very good candles, although it was pretty smelly, except that the sperm whale had something called spermaceti. It was a waxy material that could be extracted from the head of the sperm whale that burned with much more pleasant odor and was much less sooty. But interesting enough, candles basically were dispensed with when kerosene lamps were introduced. And there's a very interesting Canadian connection there. Abraham Gesner came from Nova Scotia, and he was the first one to be able to isolate kerosene. Kerosene is a fraction of oil, and he was the first one to distill it out of oil, and that gave birth to the kerosene lamp. And we even have, as you can see, a Canadian stamp dedicated to him. And of course, the whales were extremely thankful for that, because once kerosene could be produced, there was less need for whale oil, and whale hunting basically now has been eliminated in most countries, although some like Iceland, Norway, and Japan still hunt whales. But because the whales were slowly becoming extinct, there's been a great movement to stop whaling. However, the ambergris, well, that is still much sought after. And just a couple of years ago, a group of fishermen found a glob of it floating in the ocean, and was worth over $1 million. So next time that I go to the beach, I'll take a look to see whether or not I can see some of that stinky material and maybe make some bucks out of it. On the other hand, I also know how to produce ambroxan in the lab.